The first few months that Julian Assange spent in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, it was all defiant and optimistic gestures. 7 years later, he would emerge as a broken man. When British police dragged the WikiLeaks founder out of the diplomatic mission in 2019, he looked confused and was almost unrecognizable. A UN expert on torture said Assange showed symptoms of psychological torture. Some fear this torture may still be happening today. So how did we get here, and why? Julian Assange took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012, after Sweden asked the UK to extradite the WikiLeaks founder to answer allegations of rape in that country. Assange has always denied those allegations, saying they were a pretense to have him eventually extradited to the United States, where he is wanted on espionage charges.
As WikiLeaks stands under threat, so does the freedom of expression and the health of all our societies.
His supporters share this view. They say the Swedish rape allegations were fabricated and an excuse to punish Assange for the leaking of hundreds of thousands of confidential government documents and for exposing possible war crimes. One high-profile leak was a video obtained from the US military, which WikiLeaks says shows US soldiers opening fire on people in Baghdad and killing several civilians and 2 journalists. Assange is now in a maximum security prison in the UK and continues to fight against his extradition to the United States. If he loses his fight and is convicted in the US, the WikiLeaks founder faces up to 175 years in jail. The rape case in Sweden has since been dropped.
And we're joined now by Nils Melzer. He's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture who investigated this case. Mr. Melzer, thank you so much for joining us here on DW. I want to start by asking you about the rape allegations against Julian Assange, because you've been very critical of this case. We just heard there that the allegations, the charges have been dropped. Are these assault allegations false? Were they fabricated?
Well, I have to admit to you that when I first got into this case, I was very reluctant to look into this because I was under the same impression like everyone else in the public that Julian Assange is somehow guilty, that he's a narcissist, a spy, a hacker, a rapist. And so I was very reluctant to get into this case. But then his lawyers convinced me to look just at a few key pieces of evidence. And it is true that as soon as you scratch the surface of this public narrative slightly, it becomes very contradictory. And we could see that there's internal correspondence between police officers, how they manipulated the statements of the alleged victims. We can see that the alleged victim, the woman who was supposedly raped, sends a text message to a friend out of the police interrogation saying, I don't want to accuse Assange of anything. I just want him to do an HIV test, but the police wants to get their hands on him. So we have all these pieces of evidence that show that don't match up with the public narrative of the Swedes, and also the way the proceedings have then been conducted are riddled with grave due process violations which don't match any interest of getting justice here.
You said yourself that Julian Assange's lawyers approached you, asking for you to look at this case. You are the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. Was Julian Assange tortured?
Well, that was the other reason I was reluctant to get into this, because I didn't first see the link to my mandate. But then it immediately became clear to me that there's actually 3 aspects that are important here. First, Mr. Assange disclosed and revealed information and evidence for systematic torture by the US and its allies, and none of these crimes have been prosecuted. So clearly, that's a violation of the Convention Against Torture, and that's already within my mandate. Then secondly, I visited him together with 2 medical experts who specialized in examining torture victims, and both of them came to the conclusion that he showed typical signs of psychological torture. So again, this falls within my mandate, and the UK government is obliged to investigate this and to provide redress for the harm done. Now, thirdly, he is threatened with extradition to the United States. And we all know that security defendants in the United States, if convicted, are likely to be held in supermax conditions under the so-called SAMs, Special Administrative Measures, which worldwide are considered to be in violation of the prohibition of torture and ill treatment.
You've been very critical of a lot of the players in this case. Have the democratic governments of Sweden, UK, the US, also Ecuador, who are all involved here, have they intentionally manipulated justice?
This is my conclusion. Yes, I was very reluctant to come out in the public with this statement because I thought no one will believe me. But I have the pieces of evidence, and I've put the questions to these 4 states, and I asked them to explain how their conduct is compliant with human rights law. And none of them were able or even willing to respond to me and to engage in a dialogue, which certainly is not a good sign.
Why would that serve Sweden's interests? Why would it serve Sweden's interests to thwart justice here?
I think we have to take a step backwards here and just see what WikiLeaks has done. WikiLeaks has created a system where whistleblowers around the world can anonymously submit secret information about misconduct of states and have it published through WikiLeaks. Now that threatens the standard practice of governments to conduct their business in a large-scale secrecy. We have had a growing tendency of governments to classify information. Think of the Senate committee report of the US on CIA torture, and it has been completely classified, basically, apart from a summary that is, again, half of it is blackened. And then Sweden was an ally of the US in Afghanistan, and the UK obviously as well. So these states all have an interest in not having their dirty laundry washed in public.
And you're now saying that Julian Assange would not receive a fair trial in the US, one of the most powerful democracies in the world. Why is that?
Yes, now all of these states, for normal everyday cases, obviously there is a rule of law and there's no reason to doubt that. But I have seen the evidence that as soon as we have the national security interests involved, the rule of law really goes out of the window. Think of the national security cases. All of them in the US are being tried in the same court in Alexandria before juries that, are manned with mainly employees of NSA, CIA, DOD, and DOS. It's based on secret evidence, the exclusion of the public, and no one has ever been acquitted there. So there is no doubt in my mind that also with the public prejudice against Assange, he's not going to get a fair trial.
And Mr. Melzer, you've also warned that this sets a dangerous precedent for both press freedom and democracy. Why? What do you actually foresee happening?
Well, you see what we're seeing here. This is not really only about Mr. Assange, but this is what is being done to Assange. They're making an example of him to intimidate other investigative journalists who might be tempted to publish secret information about misconduct of states. Because what the US is saying here is that a foreign, non-US journalist who is not in the US and has no duty to allegiance to the US, if they publish, as any investigative journalist should do, information and evidence for government misconduct, that's espionage, and that will be punished with 175 years in prison. For comparison, the worst war criminals in The Hague received fixed-term sentences of 45 years. So that's very grave and is likely to do away with the freedom of press.
All right, a stark warning there from Nils Melzer, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture. Thank you so much for joining us on DW.
Thank you very much, Fanny.